I had the honor in 2013 of teaching a course at Union Theological Seminary that I titled The Christian Chase for Power. I saw then, 11 years ago, some particular conditions in our society that signaled a mess about to come. And it has indeed come. And I was really looking then and have continued to look at how the Christian church, and I'm saying that writ large, across denominations, etc., have often chased after political power and what the consequences of that have been. So I want to start with a quote from Jenny Ashford. This is her book, Inquisitions of the Middle Ages. And you might say, Middle Ages, what's that have to do with now? So if you'll just listen up. Throughout history, when the institutional church feels threatened, instead of seeking to strengthen its effectiveness in drawing people to the experience of the love of God, the church has tempted to hurt, vilify, imprison, and even kill all whose religious or civil messages challenge the orthodoxy, power, and privilege of church leaders. At various points in history, aligning with various political leaders and government, the church has often lost focus on the gospel of Jesus as more focus has been given to political power. I cite this particular passage because so many of us in the last decade have wondered where the Christian church is regarding the kind of moral compass that their Jesus really used to guide his life and his ministry, that moral compass, love your neighbor as yourself. That moral compass of Jesus that was about outdo one another in serving to the needs of, tending to the needs of the stranger. In this era, we have seen that kind of moral compass greatly replaced by things that I say are both self-interest and self-righteous. So the self-interest has so often been, how can we make sure we get what we need for our church in this era? And we saw that happen with Falwell and others during the 1970s and 1980s when they did not want their children, white children, to be in integrated schools, and they began developing Christian academies, and then they wanted tax breaks for the tuition for those Christian academies. That's very self-interested. But then there's often this overlay of self-righteousness that is really used to justify what at its core is self-interest. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk yet about some of the things I've been hearing as I've been interviewing people who voted for the president-elect, but I will mention one person or some of the moral compass that one person I spoke with used. And it was very much, I want to protect women from doing what I think is committing murder. And I want to protect women from transgender individuals who go from male to female. I want to protect them from having those individuals compete with them in sports. And I said, oh, this sounds very much like I'm going to protect women whether they like it or not. Very much that kind of thinking. But it is framed in some theologically oriented or theologically based self-righteousness. It is as if the Christian church has suggested to many of us that we don't have the agency from God, our creator, that's given equal to everyone to make decisions for our own lives. And it's as if the church leaders and whomever they might appoint or whoever might be their ambassadors within the religious institutions or within the government, that they and they alone have the right to determine what thus saith the Lord. And I have to use that. That's language I grew up with in the Pentecostal church. Thus saith the Lord. And it was always one or a few people who were given the power to be the arbiters, to be the interpreters for what God said. Patricia Hill Collins, who you might know from her book, Black Feminist Thought, also wrote a book called Fighting Words. And in that book, she talks about the curriculum effect. And that's the socialization, whether it's in a religious context or in a school or in the political sphere, where people are socialized to trust a leader without question. I think what is of particular importance about that, so many people have said, well, why are evangelicals seeming to be at the forefront of those who vote for someone who seems to be, by all account, morally reprehensible? But when one has been socialized to trust the leader without question, and I know about that socialization, I grew up in that kind of context. And I remember, and actually I wrote this in my dissertation that's now a book. And so if you want to get the book, please, that would be wonderful. But anyway, I wrote about this experience I had when I was about 6, 7 years old, when the pastor said, for some of you, I'm the only God you will ever see. And as a little child, something about that didn't sit well with me. It just didn't settle in my spirit. And I watched the adults in the church, and I saw them kind of shift from side to side with a measure of discomfort. And again, that was just my little child's observations, you know, but 6 or 7, you know when somebody's uncomfortable. But the only words that were spoken in that context, amen, amen. The curriculum effect is where you don't have to threaten anybody, but you just socialize them. You keep socializing them to accept what the leader says without question. And so here we are in this era where so much of that kind of allegiance has been given to one, again, who I regard as morally bankrupt and morally reprehensible. I really do. And so many have wondered, why? And how could some Christian leaders be bedfellows with this dude? There is, in this era where so many people have been taught to think a certain way and not question what leaders say, and who have been taught, if you're going to be a good Christian or a good Republican or a good whatever, you've got to toe the line. You've got to follow along with what the word is, with what the ideology is. And if you can explain it by theologizing, all the better. But how that leads us to a place that looks so foreign to the message and the ministry of Jesus Christ. And so here we are in this era. And of course, this is not the first time in history. That's the good news. It's not the first time. It is one of those times when things go so far afield that it wakes more of us up. And it is my prayer today that we would be shaken and awaken. And I know some people say we don't want to be a woke culture. And, even that language, if it were not so sad, would be absolutely laughable. Because we need people to be awake to the realities of what is happening to us. And that is part of how that ideology, when you don't question what the leader says, where it turns what's up down and what's right, wrong, and all of those kinds of things we see happening in our culture. And so pray with me, dear God of peace and God of awakening. Wake us up, regardless of how we've been socialized, not to question our religious or our political leaders. God, you have placed within each of us this divine agency and power and authority to think for ourselves. You have placed deep within our heart a compassion that doesn't let us go. And so even in the midst of all of this, where many people have replaced compassion with self-righteousness, wake us up. Help us to learn about history and how we've seen so many of the things happening in this era, how they've happened throughout history and across cultures. Wake us up and do not let us sleep. And even as I say that, I'm reminded of the words of Jesus when he asked his disciples to stay awake and watch and pray with him. And they fell asleep. Wake us up. Even in our tiredness, even in our anxiety and our fear, and even in the depression that is so pervasive in our society right now, wake us up to your love that will not let us go.